So, I am very excited to be here, and I will tell you why. I was very excited when I got this invitation, partly because of the past and partly because of the present. I am a historian by training who worked on the Enlightenment, on the 18th century Enlightenment, and as you probably know, the Scottish Enlightenment was extremely important for European Enlightenment in general. The Enlightenment was really a period where foundational transformation took place in Europe, with wars, with early industrialization, with revolutions. But what is very important is that really habits, beliefs, and ideas really shifted. And what is another interesting thing is that more and more people participated in conversations, in public debates. They could do it through reading clubs, through salons, through periodicals that were flourishing already in the 18th century. And through this, they could really influence political decisions in a way. A lot of the debates that started at the time still carry on now. I really would say that the Enlightenment is the beginning, basically, of our modern times. And one of those discussions was already at the time about inequalities, which is nowadays we say inequalities is one of the biggest problems in our societies. And the Enlightenment thinkers were thinking about solutions across several disciplines. So political economy, jurisprudence, moral philosophy, so not only one discipline. And one of the figures who comes to mind when we think about Scotland, and he was controversially received nowadays, is Adam Smith, because he's Scottish, and he's considered to be the father of capitalism, and many wouldn't like him, I know particularly in this country. But I would say that it is very important now in the times of fake news and disinformation that we really go back to the original text that these intellectuals were writing. And this is also true for the researchers today. Because actually you can really use the ideas, just picking out certain things, and use them for not the purposes for which they were really made. So one of the things that actually Adam Smith said was that no society can surely be flourishing and happy of which the far greater part of members are poor and miserable. And so he talks about inequalities, and he talks about poverty and misery, not only from a material perspective, but very much also from the perspective of well-being. He's talking about moral sentiment, but this is really about well-being. So he had a very complex vision of inequality, and these are the terms in which we want to think about inequalities today as well. And the reason why I'm basically citing the Enlightenment is not only because I love the Enlightenment, because I worked on it, but also because actually we are living now in very similar transformational times. We are talking about the fourth industrial revolution, which means basically digitalization, and the digital revolution really puts new divides into society. So that strengthens the divides even more. And we have to look at complex solutions in the same way as we did during the Enlightenment, across disciplines, not only with one discipline. And this is actually in this context that I would like to address the issue that we are talking about, which is about transforming our education systems with the help of maybe early childhood education and care. And it is really, I have to say, I really thank you for inviting me. I will, of course, give a burst perspective of what you are doing in Scotland, because I am a European policymaker. So I was a researcher originally, so I feel very attached to research, but I work in policy, which is a bit of a different area. And I work at European level. But I think the thinking from that perspective can really help thinking at national level, and might open new avenues for you as well in your work. In my presentation, I will talk about 3 topics. One will be that I want to talk briefly about the pressures that are on the current education system. Secondly, I would like to talk about how early childhood education and care is addressing some of these issues in often very innovative ways. And thirdly, I would like to talk about the governance mechanisms, so how governance needs to be, and I would explain what this means, needs to be organized so that actually these innovations can happen, and so that the education system can really transform. So first, about the pressures. So we know that we have basically this mass education system since the 19th century. And of course, the idea was first that people get into education. Of course, it wasn't for everyone in the beginning. We said it is about, the main pressure at the time was we have to teach people how to become a citizen. So we have to teach people the democratic values. Later on, we wanted education system for all, so that everybody can get in. Now we want that everybody gets good results in the end. So these are huge tasks. And it's more and more we expect that the education system responds to that in a timely manner for everyone. And of course, we are sometimes said that it doesn't. And nowadays, related to inequalities, we really expect the education system to counteract the inequalities. And we know that, and surely you know that because you work in the field, that the education system on itself will never manage to counteract these inequalities. The education system has to work together with other sectors, and this is the only way how we might actually improve the situation. So first, I would like to show you a slide just about the result of inequalities, which is child poverty. And I know that this is a problem in Scotland, but it is a problem in the world, but I will actually show you something about Europe. So on this slide, you can see three groups of people. So the children, 0 to 17, the adults, 18 to 64, and 65 plus. We are talking about the at risk of poverty, but it is also, this chart also takes into consideration when you come from severely materially deprived backgrounds, or if you come from household where there is low work intensity, which means that, I can explain exactly what these categories mean, but I think it's enough that you understand that these are all quite economic terms and mainly related to income. So that's the main point. And what you can see is, you can see on top and bottom, the countries on the extremes. I find it very funny that they call it Czechia. It's the Czech Republic, basically. But it's where it's the least, where people are the least deprived or at risk of poverty, and where there are the most. And in the middle, you can see the average, the European average. And so it is very clear that the age group that is most at risk are the children. 0 to 17, it's 24.9%. So that means 1 in 4 children in Europe. And this is, of course, an average, and it varies across the countries. But I would suggest that actually looking at poverty only from the point of income is not the best way to look at it. Or let's say it's important, but it doesn't give a full picture. So there was a very interesting study done by the UNICEF Innocenti Center that actually looked at the Sustainable Development Goals that are relevant in some way for the children. I think you know what the Sustainable Development Goals are. So these are the UN 17 main goals that we should achieve, all countries globally, for people in general. So access to education, gender balance, things about the environment. So it grows across several sectors. In any case, it looked at multidimensional. The study then looked at poverty from a multidimensional perspective. And it said, let's look according to 7 perspectives at poverty, which means access. So the categories were access to nutrition, to health, to education. And basically it showed that 1 in 3 children don't have access to at least 2 of those, even in families that are supposed to be not poor. according to these income-related statistics, okay? So the problem is actually, when we look at it from a multidimensional perspective, even bigger. And this is why it is very, very important that I repeat that we really need comprehensive measures. So education in itself will not solve the problem, but we still will focus on education now. We also know that we often say about education that the education system very often reproduces the socioeconomic inequalities. And this is why it is very interesting to look at practices that actually really try to help to overcome these. And early years, if it's in political debates, etc., it really comes in very often there, that it is very, very good in helping to combat or even prevent so that the intergenerational poverty and inequality carries on. Okay, so why is early childhood very important and why is it so innovative? I think one of the reasons is that it is outside the formal education system. So now I will go to the second part of my presentation when I want to talk to you about early childhood and what is happening in early childhood education and care. The first thing that I would like to emphasize is that there is an increasing understanding across the world, actually, and this is why also in these sustainable development goals we talk about early childhood education and care, but in Europe for sure, and I will talk about that early childhood is really important for education. So early childhood education and care, so the early years, 0 to school, depending on the country when school starts, is really very important for education as well. And to prove this to you, I just show you a chart which I will apologize because this is data from 2014 and 15. So for instance, just based on yesterday's presentation, I know that the situation in Malta is already different. There are two types of systems, roughly. One is the unitary system in Europe, which means that the early years are treated in one phase, 0 to school. That means generally that the curriculum is designed together for the whole age group, that the staff training is designed in the same way, that there are child-staff ratios are decided for the whole phase together. Whereas in the split system, it is for the older children, there is one kind of regulation, and for the younger, there is another one. And more importantly, very often in the second type, in the separated type, very often it's not one ministry that is responsible. So it's not only the education ministry, but also social affairs, etc. But what I really wanted to show you that the pink are the unitary systems where actually it's only the education ministry that has the main responsibility. You can see that a growing number of countries, nearly half of them, have now already the education ministry in charge. This is very important because this reflects the understanding that early childhood is about education, not only about looking after the children while their parents are working. And then you can see those, because Scotland belongs also this, where it seems that it's mixed. And this is because in these systems, part of the system is already unitary. So let's say the curriculum in Germany is already designed for the whole phase together, but the staff training is still in separate institutions, and the expectations are separate. So what is the other thing? So we understand it's important for education. What is the other thing that is extremely important in early childhood education? What I heard over and over again yesterday is that in early childhood education and care, you really focus your thinking on the child, on the active and competent child. This is not the case when it comes to school policy. We talk about it all the time, that it's child-centered, but it's not so much in the center as it is for thinking about early years. I'm talking about thinking about early years policies. I am not talking about the practice now. And what does this active, competent child mean? That the child is not a recipient of the learning, but he is an active he participates in his own learning. He can give feedback. So it gives the base to what we really need to understand, I think, in the first place, to develop our education system is on how children really learn. What influences their learning? What influences their behavior? Very often, particularly when we go to later stages, we don't really think about this. So this is what is, I think, very, very important when it comes to early years. And there are other things also what early years do actually differently, and we have heard so many beautiful examples up till this morning, what early childhood does very differently. One is that it really combines care and education. So it really talks about, but this is actually a very English thing, because in this, that we have to say care and education, because in certain languages, like in German, when you say Bildung, or in the Scandinavian social pedagogy, these things are not even separate. So when I work with some European policymakers, they constantly said, but drop that word care. What do you mean? Education means caring also. Putting a child to bed is education also. It's also learning. But in any case, this is very important that it goes together. And I would say at the very beginning of my career, I always say this, but I will still repeat because my colleagues even used to make jokes about me. I was teaching secondary school students and I was constantly talking about their souls. And so I always say that care and education is important even when you're 16. So it doesn't stop when you're 6, but I wouldn't even say that it stops after P1. I think 16-year-olds are terribly vulnerable, actually, very often much more vulnerable than 10-year-olds. And so to think that care stops at the end of primary school because we're just going now with our heads to university or wherever is really, I think, personally wrong. So care and education, this is one thing you do really well. Another thing is that you very much focus on play. Why does play stop? At 6, we don't play anymore? I disagree with it. You can play. Maybe you play different things. But we will hear about play, how complex that is. But so play, the importance of play, that you use a lot of assessment methods in early childhood. I will not give you the full list, but just to reassure you that you do lots of things differently. Assessment, you think about, you do a lot of formative assessment, which some schools do, but it's not. You do a lot of observation. These are things that in schools, generally doesn't happen. Of course, there are wonderful classrooms sometimes where it does, but it's not mainstream. Then it comes out of misery in a way because a lot of stuff is not really qualified, let's say at university level, etc. But the fact that we really look at staff competencies, and I will talk about this later, and not forcibly only at the qualification levels, but really at the competencies, how much are the competencies that the staff has really relevant for the job that they are doing. That we have conducted a study at European level about this, and the study really showed how much very often the profiles of the training and the job profile don't correspond at all, if they exist at all. But even if they exist, very often there is no. So this kind of thinking, that we should think about staff competencies, that is also something that is very good in the early years. Then to mention one more is that you work really much more, the whole conference is about this, with parents. That you work with the community. These are things that the school talk about all the time, but it is very difficult to do it because the school has done it already in a certain way. So it needs to change and it's very hard. Whereas for you, you have the freedom to do things differently because many things are still not regulated in the same way. And you would say, luckily. And then finally, the integration, that there are a lot of integrated services in early childhood where the early childhood service works with the social services, with family services, with employment services, and it's not only about the kindergarten. So this is again something, as I said, and for combating inequalities and helping really vulnerable families and children, this is extremely difficult. So it was basically based on all these things that we knew about early childhood that we created at European level some kind of, it's visionary, but it's also a tool that countries can use. This is it was called Principles of a Quality Framework, but if you like, this is now already a recommendation by the Council. So this is the highest level of political strategic document that you can get in education at European level. And the main idea was that we focused on quality, where we said, I will explain why we did that, and that excess is part of quality, so that we don't talk about excess and quality. Anyway, I will explain what the framework is about, but what I want to say first is that we did this with all the member states, and the work, what we have done, was based on research. So we worked with researchers, and in my group there were policymakers. We also looked at the practice, so we traveled to countries, we looked at how kindergartens work, but we also talked with people in the government, we talked with people in the local administrations. And so we, in a way, by observing also what happens on the grounds and what we know in the research, we try to distill the most important principles that are important to look at when we want to look at quality in early childhood. And of course, we had the difficulty that we have to create something that is good for 28 countries, and you can imagine that this is really a very difficult thing. So the reason why we created a framework, because we said this is a flexible way of looking at things. This is just for scaffolding. You can have different entry points, you can have different ways of interpretation, but it still gives you like a map through which you can think about your system. The main ideas in the system are that you see four principles, around, is this working? Like the voice and image of the child, which means that these are the four things that we have to think about whichever area we are thinking about, whether it's governance, workforce, we have to think about this also all the time. So the image and voice of the child, we heard yesterday a really interesting presentation about what the voice of the child means. Then that we focus on process quality, meaning we focus on the interaction, not on the structural qualities, so not the child-staff ratios or the codifications of staff, but what is the interaction between the children, between staff and children, between the staff and the parents, between the parents and the community. Then we focus on partnerships with the parents, among the parents, with the administration, and that we talk about a competent system, which I will explain to you what that means. It basically means, but I will go into detail more, that the competence doesn't have to be only at the individual level. There needs to be a competent institution. There needs to be competent between the institutions, and the system needs to be competent too. And so the framework focuses on the child, as you can see, where quality informed by high expectations doesn't mean that everybody has to go to Harvard University. It means that everybody should achieve their full potential, depending on where they can go. And then we focus on 5 areas, and in these 5 areas, I won't read them out because you can see them, we identify 2 principles that are the most important. I mean, you can find this document online, and basically we put them on an equal level. So depending on where your system is, you can think just about one also. What we know already that before even this has become something official, countries have already used it for thinking about their system. So first of all, they organized meetings around it where they brought together very different people working on very different services on very different levels, just to talk about early years. This in itself is already wonderful. And then, of course, they could use it maybe just for thinking about the curriculum along the principles that we defined, or about workforce training, etc. I think this is an important tool because it really reflects on what I found in writings by the Center of the Developing Child at Harvard, that very much emphasizes how much we have to really use now the science to develop our education systems, meaning we really have to have an education system that is adjusted to the child developmental phases and not to some kind of predisposed ideas that we might have where children should be. And so there, they really emphasize that it's very important that the cutting-edge research that comes from many disciplines is first of all available and understandable for decision makers. This is already a very big task that I think very often researchers don't really understand. It doesn't mean that you have to make it dumb, but it's a very, I tell you, I come from research. When I first had to write my policy document, I was accused of being too intellectual, and I thought, what? I mean, this is really precise what I wrote. And then they said, no, because in research I had a wonderful head of unit who had very similar education than me, so he understood what my problem was. He said, when you do research, you have to show that you understand the complexity of the field and that you manage to position in this complexity your particular point of view. In policy, you have to make it really simple. So it's exactly the opposite. And the reason is not because policymakers are dumb. I mean, some of them are, but that's not the main reason. The main reason is because they really have to make a decision. So where should I put this money now? We have this budget, so I put it here or there? You tell me now. Okay, you have an hour. You look into the research, right? And then you will find something, and then you will go along that line. And this is why, of course, it shouldn't work like that. This is why there needs to be an ongoing dialogue between research and policy. And this is why I'm saying that this tool, for instance, we tried to develop this way. It is also very important that the research is also somehow available for practitioners, that they also understand that they can also reflect on their own practice, and then they can feed back into the research, and as a result also into policy, their own experience. And this is, for instance, through doing action research. And then you can really develop a research and development platform that really helps. This is something that you only hear in business, but actually you can have that also in education and then really have innovation. So now I said already the magic word that I want to talk about a bit, which is about innovation. So what do we do? So how can early childhood influence the education system? Because I know I have worked so much together with early childhood practitioners, policymakers, decision makers who are actually depending, it's really the worry of the practitioners that we don't want the early childhood service to become a school, and that it is not about school readiness, but that we have our own language, etc., etc. And I would say that you also want to influence the school system because, as I say, you have a lot to offer. So, of course, what we need to do is innovation. That's very easy, right? And what is innovation? So, innovation is that we introduce something new into a system. There is an ecosystem of innovation where actually there is a lot of interaction between lots of players and lots of organizations, including the government. But of course, very often innovation is in the mainstream system, and this is what we call sustained innovation. So it doesn't really change the system. It might modify it, it might make it a bit better. And this is what I was saying, this is what the education system tried to do through decades to respond to the the recurring new demands. But there is a point where you just can't do it. So what I want to suggest is that we look a bit to a completely different discipline that I know many of you will not like, which is the business world. And in the business world, there is they talk about another kind of innovation where they say that the innovation creates a new market and a new value network. And eventually, this new market and new value network, I will explain it what I mean behind the words, disrupts the currently existing market and then even replaces it. And this innovation is called disruptive innovation. And disruptive innovation is a two-stage process where first the innovation happens outside the existing system. So this is why I said early childhood is very lucky to be outside the formal education system in certain ways still. And so it can then disrupt the existing system and maybe even replace it at one point. I mean, the practices, I don't mean, you understand what I mean. So the concept of disruptive innovation comes from Clayton Christensen, who works at Harvard Business School. I mean, he's already retired. And he, of course, talked about markets and business when he introduced this notion. But he also thought along these lines about education. Of course, the American education system that has other problems than the European one. He identified a few characteristics, but maybe before I will give you an example. He gives an example of disruptive innovation from the tech world, so from the digital world, but then you will understand what I mean about early childhood versus education system. So he says that there was a time of the mini computers where mini computers were the only computers on the market. These mini computers were very costly and they only served a certain part of the public. And they had to be wealthy and they had to be very educated also. And of course, this was, they constantly introduced innovations so that it could respond to new demands. But at the same time, Apple, that created the first personal computers, originally the first personal computers were toy computers that were made for children because they were so simple and they could do so few things. And then slowly, they of course developed more and more. So it could do, with the technology developing, it could do more and more things. And what happened in the end? We all have now our iPhones, etc. So it took over the market, and basically it made the mini computers disappear from the market. So it overtook basically the market. And so what happened was that it first started to serve people, children, who were non-consumers, who were excluded from the market. It also did it in an affordable and simple way. It did it outside the main market. And actually what happened was that the main market ignores this for a long time because they look only at their own audience, right? And they wanted just to innovate according to what those really sophisticated, richer people were expecting. And in the meantime, from the backplane, slowly, this other type of computer took over. So this is the principle, and these are the main criteria of disruptive innovation. So what is important is, when you now go more into the practicalities, is that really in the first phase, we find a solution for a problem, okay? And this can be, and that means, in his words, we create a new value network. And this happens outside the mainstream, outside the regulations, outside the standardizations. This is what you do in many of your practices, in many of your projects, etc. And then in the second phase, this can be then slowly rolled out and it can take over those practices. So what you are trying to do, that you try to bring the play to the P1, okay? And you try to educate the staff and how to deal with children. Okay, you go to P1, maybe at one point you will go to P2, etc., etc. So you, I think you understand, you are nodding, so I think you understand the process. So I want to introduce still two notions before I go to the next part of my presentation, is that he talks about different types of teams. One of the most important ones from the point of view of disruptive innovation is the so-called heavyweight teams. Heavyweight teams are people they are representatives of different organizations who come out of their own organizations, and they create a team with a very strong leader, and they then create a new architecture. So they are able to think beyond their own organizations, and they manage to knit together the system or find a solution for the problem, if you like, in a new way. Okay, and then he also talks about lightweight teams. Lightweight teams are people who rather just carry out the project, but they are also very important. But that's a different kind of team. But the heavyweight is really important. So this is obviously not a linear process. This is also very important. And the outcomes of it, in many ways, are unpredictable. These are all things that standardized systems really don't like. So the big challenge is, how do you remain open, but at the same time secure against shocks? This is the big question. So how can you do that? So we said what we would like to do, but how do we do it? And this is what leads me then to the third part of my presentation. I hope I'm still okay on time, and maybe there will be time for questions as well then. And so how do we do it? I already told you that we conducted a study this will be the magic word. We conducted a study. I mean, it was commissioned by the commission. It's not we, it's researchers who did it, because we work closely together with researchers, or at least I do. The study was called Competent Requirements of Staff in Early Childhood Education and Care. It is the core study. Maybe many of you know it. And I think it was published 2012, around that time. And the reason why we did it, I wrote the call for that study, was because we wanted to see exactly what I said. What kind of competences do we need so that the early childhood services really work well? And we wanted to talk about competences, I repeat, because we knew that a big part of the staff doesn't have the qualifications. They don't have higher education qualifications, but they still might be competent, right? So they might be sometimes even more competent than the ones who have in certain areas. So this study then came up with a new definition of competence. They didn't like, because in the European policymaking we talk about competence. It means knowledge, skills, and attitudes. They said competence means knowledge, practices, and values. This is what I will give you examples for that in a minute. So this is one thing. And they said we have to think about competence not only on an individual level, but on an institutional level, on an interinstitutional level, and on a system level. So all the levels need to be competent, and they have identified competencies along the knowledge practices and values in all those areas. So to give you an example, let's say on an individual level, it means that knowledge is that you know the different strategies for learning. A practice is that you are able to create an effective learning environment. And the value is that you understand that learning is co-constructed. Or if you talk about interinstitutional, you have the knowledge of interagency work. You understand what this means. You are able to, so your practice is that you are able to engage into networking. And then the value is that you understand what diversity means, you respect diversity, you respect democracy. So these are just examples. So this study is also available. But the main idea is that this is a learning organization where everybody is learning and critically reflecting on the practice all the time. So there is constant conversation going on. So what I would add to this, because this will then help me to link it to the other things I would like to tell you about governance, is that in this system, people are aware of their roles and they feel responsible for their roles. I think this is very, very important, because for decision making, whichever level it is, you need to be able to do that. So then, how do you govern a system like that? So governance is something that I think a very complex notion that a lot of people don't really understand, but everybody talks about it, that we need to govern differently, etc. Governance means basically processes of social organization and social coordination. So it includes a lot of interaction and decision-making processes among different actors. I have put it on a slide so that you can see it. So then good governance doesn't mean that we always have the right decision. I think we should be more philosophical about that, but that we have the right mechanisms in place, that the quality of the decision is good, so that we involve always those people, those institutions, etc., that we need to find the right decision. So this is what governance means, or at least I would like to talk about governance in this context. Nowadays, when we look at education, it's very, very complex. There are so many players. So there are the teachers, the children, the parents, the community, all the stakeholders. And then the local administration, the government. So it's really, really complex. And of course, we want to say that everybody should participate. So this is very important, that it is participatory. I will talk about that later, how this is possible in practice. But first, I would say that there are a few characteristics that many organizations, and among them the OECD, also identified as like guiding principles of how you govern a complex system. So one is that the focus is on processes and not on structures. This is very important, that there is an alignment across the system, and so that all the actors who are relevant can be involved. It is flexible and able to adapt to change. That means that the feedback mechanism is in it, and so it makes it quality assured and accountable. So it's able to reflect on itself also. It works through capacity building and stakeholder involvement, but this can only work, and this will lead me to my next point, is that there is a vision on which everybody agrees. Where are we going? What is really the objective that we would like to achieve? And this way it can harness on the ideas of the actors involved. Then the fourth thing is that it has a whole system approach. That means that the policies and the different roles and responsibilities are aligned in a way so that we can really take decisions efficiently and also carry them out, so that there shouldn't be a conflict between accountability and trust and between innovation and risk avoidance. Because these are then really problems that will stifle the system. And finally, it is very important also that it harnesses on evidence, that it really is informed by research. And here I would say that the research in the education field, so the research that we need is that we really want to know as policymakers what to do, why, and how. And we will see that in certain contexts it works for a lot, but then there are some for whom it doesn't. So this is an anomaly. So we have to then go back in the research and see what to do with those, not just forget about them, because that's the next research question. So we also have to see where things work, because they sometimes don't work in certain contexts. And research really has to look at that. And it's also very important then, it follows from this logically, that research is not only descriptive, but prescriptive. It should really show the way forward also. So how do we solve? It should help the problem solving, if you like. Now, I want to talk a bit about the practice again, that of course it's complex and we should follow all these principles, but of course this is going to be very, very difficult. And in education, and here I will go back to Christensen, who talks about education, in education there isn't an agreement among the players where we are going and how we should get there. And so he identifies different governance tools. I will explain, it's a very complex. So so he says, how can we change a system? Does it help when we give financial incentives, when we give more training for the staff, we write a new curriculum? Generally, I'm sure all of you know that this in itself will not change the system. The most important things, the thing that changes the system is that we need to understand where we want to go and what are the steps that we want to take. So on the vertical axis, you see here, okay, do we agree on the direction? And here on the horizontal, what are the steps that we should take? Now, depending on, we measure the temperature in the room, and depending on where we are standing, we have to choose different policy tools. And here, this is where I'm saying that participation doesn't always work. So, for instance, in education, sometimes you have to separate the players because otherwise never a decision will be taken. So, you are laughing, so you must work in education. So, but you know that the politically correct thing to say and write in policy documents is that we need participation. And it is true, we do need participation. So I'm not debating that. So he says the 4 different tools. So you use power tools, and he describes what kind of techniques they are, when there is no consensus on either of them. Or you choose leadership tools where you agree on the vision, but you don't agree on the steps. And maybe this is often the case in education. And here I would point out that one area for research, I think, in early childhood is on leadership. I really think there isn't enough research on that. And I think leadership is the most, we know from the schools already that that's very important. But in early childhood, we don't have enough research on that. Then, when you don't agree on the vision, but you agree on the steps, then you use management tools. So it's quite administration. Or if you agree on both, this is when you can all participate, and then really democracy works. And then you can also see that certain practices, of course, overlap between the different tools. But I think that this is a very interesting way of trying to put it on a more practical level. So a better governance system really rebuilds trust in the system. It's very important that everybody trusts the system. And how do you rebuild that trust? First of all, that there is efficiency of the system. When we think about education, right, it's not always efficient, so that it's efficient. And that also means that we really deliver on the mandate that we said we are going to deliver on. But we have to judge well what our mandate is and how we get there. So these are all very, very different steps. And the trust, so the governance should help to rebuild the trust in the system. So then I would say these are a few, I understand that it's still theory, but it's still based on, because this, again, so these tools, this is again based originally on business thinking, reflected on and used for education. So I'm going towards the end of my presentation. What I would say is, so how do we envisage then in practice how early childhood and schools should work together? And for that, we understand we need a smarter governance where research and policy and practice really work together. And we know that generally, the way we think about it now, that one level prepares the children for the next level, right? So here, again, coming from another study that I will explain, or maybe I will first talk about the study because you will look at the slide and not listen to me. We commissioned another study where we wanted to look at the relationship between early childhood education and care and early school leaving. Because at European level, we have another tool where we say there are different measures to be introduced to prevent or intervene in case of early school leaving. And of course, one of the preventive measures is early childhood education and care. But if you look at the data, we don't really see, but how does early childhood education and care do this? There are 10 years between you finish early childhood and because you are early school leaver, this is measured at the age of 15, 16, right? So we said we would like to look at the competence profiles, but also social-emotional competence, so it's not only about reading, writing, etc., of the early school leavers. And let's see what can the early childhood field give to the students that could help them to avoid or prevent from early school leaving. Of course, it turned out that, because it was just an 18-month study, that they really looked just in the literature literature, and they did a big literature review and meta-analysis of the existing data on this, and then they designed a lot of new questions for research. But we could really see that certain things that I think you know, that prosocial behavior, self-regulation, attitudes towards learning, these are all things that actually can be very well acquired in very early years. And of course, if the system afterwards in the next 10 years is really bad, you will lose it. But if it's just good enough to maintain it, then this can help you actually to perform still better at the age of 15. Now, this study also created some kind of vision about how to connect early childhood with education, and said we don't want to have school-ready children, but we want to have a ready system. So instead of school readiness, or not school readiness, but ready children. And for that, we need to have different elements of the system that are ready. So we have to have ready families, we have to have ready communities, we have to have ready early childhood education and care and schools. And you will also see that in this vision, the different players are not hierarchically built on each other, that from the family it goes to early childhood, but they are all working together. And by the way, I mentioned this to you yesterday, that in the study, they did actually focus groups where they brought together early childhood education and care practitioners and school, primary and secondary school teachers, and to talk about certain issues. And it was amazing that in many systems, it was the first time that these people met each other at all, not to mention that they worked together. So this is, and what is important about this vision is that you always have to imagine that it is based on a constant work between policy and research, where basically after a while there is a common language that both of them are able to use. And neither of them feels that, oh, this is not what I meant, what are you doing, or the other way around, right? So that is a long process. And this can then also help that if you have a practice that works on a small scale, then with the help of research, you can upscale it or you can roll it out. So in a way, this vision covers a bit what I meant to you from the center of the developing child, this idea of really research-informed education system that actually focuses, and this is the most important thing, that focuses on child development and designs the learning pathway of children according to what we know about children's learning and children's behavior. And this study actually then also defined 4 principles. Maybe this is interesting for you, because then they also said how to achieve it. So for instance, they say the system needs to be a coherent system, that's obvious, but that it needs to be efficient. That means that the way the different levels work together is that there is continuity in terms of professionalism, in terms of curriculum design, and it is aligned with how children learn. That it follows the principle of equity. That means that the professional capacity is constantly built upon, and that the pedagogy is really pupil-centered. Then that the cohesion means that we really monitor children's experiences and we feed it back into research, and then we also feed it back into our practice. And finally, that it is representative, so in a way that it reflects on the diverse population that it serves. So these were then the 4, so efficiency, equity, cohesion, and representativeness. Again, if you are interested, I can give you the links to these studies. So to conclude, I will then go back to the Enlightenment, and I will say that like in the Enlightenment, Enlightenment thinkers try to use scientific reasoning to change and solve big societal problems. In the same way, we need to do the same thing in an interdisciplinary matter. So we need to use a lot of kind of science, so not only education science. We need to use a lot of other disciplines to address these issues by always centering on the human being, in our case, of course, on young children. And we know that in this, education can play a huge role. What I was trying to argue for, that early childhood can help a lot for the education system to find solutions. And what is important is that we have a system when we find a balance between openness and security against shocks. And for that, I tried to propose to you basically I brought together two very different ideas. One from education research, the participatory governance, and the other one from business research, basically talking about efficient teams. And then I would turn to all of you. I think you are policymakers, researchers, practitioners. So you are actually in the position to be able to create heavyweight teams, and if necessary, and really change the architecture that is there. And I repeat, early years can really do it well because many of the things are not regulated and standardized yet. And so really, I think you should dare to do things differently. And this is why I would finish with this picture, because this is my message to you, that yes, we all want to go upwards and improve, but we can do this sometimes by diverging from the norm. And I think this is what you should all do. And I'm also trying to do the same thing in my own job. Thank you.